you play every 3 or 4 days for pretty much 9-10 months of the year. So it's a pretty relentless role, where actually social life takes a bit of a backseat, and some things might be planned and might be in the diary, but fall by the wayside when results go certain ways. I personally believe you have to really make sure you don't go too narrow down a path of just data-informed work, because you're working with people mainly. It's a people business. Showing yourself to be willing to a potential employer is a very surefire way of getting respected and liked quite quickly.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us today is Mark Bonner, Director of Football at Cambridge Utd Football Club. Mark is something of a rarity in professional football in England these days, a highly rated English manager with a bright future. Now, Mark has a long association with the U's. He first joined the club in, 2002, working at the Centre of Excellence for 3 years before spending 5 or 6 years at Southend as a coach in the academy. Mark returned to Cambridge in 2011, working in various roles in the club's academy there. By 2018, he was first team coach, and by March 2020, maybe not such an auspicious month, he was head coach. Immaculate timing, you may say, just as COVID struck, meaning his first game in charge came about 6 months after his appointment. But it was well worth it, because Cambridge knocked Championship Birmingham City 2 leagues above out of the League Cup. Mark led the club to promotion to the third tier, League One, at the end of his first season in charge. I think there's a picture over your shoulder there, Mark, of that celebration. And that led to a new 3-year contract. The most eye-catching win, perhaps, during his tenure was a famous 1-0 away win at Premiership Newcastle Utd in the FA Cup in January 2022. But a year and a half later, after a bit of a slump in form, Cambridge was sitting just 4 points above the drop zone, and Mark was, shall we say, relieved of his duties. And after a bit of a rollercoaster ride with 6 months in charge at Gillingham, including a Manager of the Month award, Mark parted company with Gills at the start of this year, only to resurface as Director of Football at Cambridge 6 weeks later. And this is his current role at the time of recording, just before the end of the 2024-25 season. Now, Mark, I trust that's a good summary of who you are and what you do and your track record to date. First of all, welcome to Data Malarkey. And secondly, is there anything that you'd like to add? Anything I've got wrong?
No, all perfect, Sam. Thanks for having me. Nice to be here, and quite nice hearing back the last sort of 20 years, really, and all the things that have happened.
It's been eventful, and you know, the centre of gravity bringing you back to Cambridge. We'll talk about that more as we go through. But before we talk about data and information, I want to start with a question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you you, and it doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about the day job. So tell me, if you would, Mark, how do you spend your time?
It probably depends what time of year we're talking about. I think the reality of working in professional sport, particularly football, your life is pretty much dictated by the calendar, the schedule, which is pretty relentless. And I think depending on the role that you hold, it's probably a little bit different. So having spent 4 or 5 years as a head coach, there's very little time. That is an all-consuming role where it's very, very difficult to put it down. And the English football calendar means you play every 3 or 4 days for pretty much 9-10 months of the year. So it's a pretty relentless role, where actually social life takes a bit of a backseat, and some things might be planned and might be in the diary, but fall by the wayside when results go certain ways. So I'd say that this role now, Director of Football role, is less in the spotlight. It does create you a little bit more time, I think, and I hope in the months ahead, work won't be the only thing that I am doing, but it's certainly a job that consumes you a lot of the time, and my interests are football hugely. So a lot of my time outside of, let's say, working within the club might be scouting or watching games elsewhere for my own research. There's been a lot of academic work I've done in the last few years, courses and things through the League Managers Association as well, which has taken up a bit of time. And then aside from that, spending time with family, and music is a bit of a love in our family. So anything that spends some time doing that is nice, but that is few and far between, unfortunately.
Very good. Well, yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that it's all consuming, but good that you perhaps have got a bit more time to think in this Director of Football role. Now, I want to start with a big general open question. Football is a game that creates enormous passion and emotion on the pitch, in the dugout, on the terraces, on the sofas at home. Do you think data and analytics kind of has a role to play in football?
Without doubt, yes. because solely making decisions that are emotional is probably ill-informed and ill-advised. I think that having a balance between emotion and gut and relational things is really important. But data can guide and inform that decision-making process. And sometimes when you're clouded by emotion in something that is so high-pressured, that isn't always the best state to make those decisions in. And therefore, having things that can keep you grounded, having maybe almost that scaffolding that you always fall back to, that foundation where data can tell you whether you are on or off track, or can send you in a different direction, can be really useful. So I certainly think it's got a part to play. It's being probably used and rolled out greater than ever before, and at the moment that doesn't look like slowing down. But we have to be mindful that there are other things that are important too. So yeah, I think there's a huge part for data to play. If people aren't on board with it, they'll probably fall away from what the future is anyway. But I also think we have to, I personally believe you have to really make sure you don't go too narrow down a path of just data-informed work, because you're working with people mainly. It's a people business, and you've got to find that balance, that balance right. And ultimately, you've got to make sure that the data that you're using is the right stuff for you in any moment. So I think how used is important, but its use is vital.
I think your point about balance is very well made. I was listening to a football podcast this morning when I was heading to a meeting, and it was talking about the time of recording. There's been a Premiership game in which underperforming Man City won a game in the last minute with a last minute kick, and their legendary manager Pep Guardiola celebrated as if he'd won 3 Champions Leagues. And they were talking about that sort of that kind of reaction and the contrast that there is. And they were saying that obviously Sir Alex Ferguson, he would always celebrate, like it was the most incredible thing. And then they contrasted it with Rafa Benitez, who a goal would go in, he'd get his notebook out and make a little note, or Carlo Ancelotti, whose eyebrow goes up when a goal goes in. I think we've got with Fergie and Pep, we've got the one extreme to a goal, and with Ancelotti and Rafa, we've got the other. But I'm completely with you on balance, that balancing the rational and the emotional. Now, as a manager, and I know we'll come on to talk about the differences between manager and director of football with data, but as a manager in the modern professional game, what sort of access to data and statistics do you have about players' performance in training, during live games, post-match analysis? And to what extent does that guide the decisions that you make?
Well, I think it might be relative to the level that you're at. So obviously the top clubs would have incredible amount of resource in every area, and data will be one of them. And as always, anything that goes on at the top filters its way down and finds its way to other clubs. So I think, for example, in the times I've been in doing this role or head coach role, the use of data has grown, the availability of data has grown, and the number of providers for such data has grown hugely. And the amount that you can capture, and almost every area from the moment you walk in to the moment you leave can be tracked, recorded, analysed. We have to be careful not to overload people with that. I think that's very important in a pressured environment, that we put too much of that and people try to become experts in data rather than experts in the game. And there's a fine line between that, certainly for players. So I think that's something to consider. But as manager, I think ultimately you're always trying as the manager to find every area you can where you can improve, any way you can make the boat go faster, any way you can help score a win. That is it. So I think you're asking of the small team of people that you work with to bring you solutions and ideas and challenge your thinking all the time. And part of the skill of the workforce is to know what stuff matters and what stuff is interesting but irrelevant. And sometimes I think in a short paced time, you haven't got long to turn a game plan around and get ready for the next game. So I think there's certain things that are an element of data might help you right now, immediately, and something can be parked because it's part of a bigger picture or a longer term goal. And prioritizing what you use when becomes important. But from my perspective as a head coach, or even in the role now, we would be able to track the physical side of the game in terms of the output of the players, every individual, and then the collective. And that is a really interesting piece of work that a lot of our performance and sports science departments would use to track and measure players' training loads and see how that then influences the next game and the next training session. So that side of it is a huge part of the game. And then you've got the performance data, so everyone's individual output in terms of the basic statistics that you'd see on every TV show, possession and the new one, XG, that you'll see all the time. And then beneath that, there are so many layers. And then it's about being disciplined enough to say, what's the stuff that really matters to us? And I always think with data and with anything, if you know what the end point that you're aiming for is, then you can evaluate against that. Otherwise, you've just got numbers, you'll throw them out, people will analyze them, but they're not necessarily the ones that really matter. So it's really important to have that internal, first, the discipline to stick to the stuff that matters to you, but actually clarity, conviction, and idea and vision at the beginning that says, this is what good is for us. And then you can judge against that rather than here's a load of numbers, pick out the good or the bad, because you can find data, can't you, to shape any story. And it's trying to make sure that you've got that real clarity, I think, first of all.
That's brilliant. Now, when you're kind of in the game as it is now, there's a. I mean, I'm thinking of the games that I watch. You see the all the different kind of management staff and some people with their set piece coaches. They've been really kind of under the spotlight this year. Are you able to track if a player is having a dip in form actually in real time during the game, or is that something that's only done by the super elite clubs?
Yeah. So what can we track in real time? The physical data is there, so you can see section by section, is someone dropping off for any reason. But that is a standalone figure. Maybe you have to consider how often's the ball been in play, what's the context of the game. So I don't know, the distance that you cover or the high speeds that you run can be will hugely be linked to how often the ball is in play. So the ball in play time in the Premier League is much, much higher than it is in League Two, for example. And from game to game, you can see quite a big swing. The average ball in play time in League Two last year would have been around 48 of the 90 minutes. In the Premier League, it will be probably above 60. So that will have a huge, obvious link to, number one, how many restarts there are, how many transitions there are, and what is capable to cover in terms of physical distance within a game. Likewise, if we were to play a game where we were the dominant team with the ball, we regained the ball as high up the pitch as possible, that would look very different physically from a game that was very transitional and complete counter-attack, end-to-end basketball type, versus a game where you are defending low in the pitch, you can't get out your half, you actually move side to side loads, but you don't cover much distance because you don't travel very far. So sometimes the context of the game needs to be considered, not just that number in isolation. So the physical side of the game is really easy to track. Now, obviously in levels that, in real time, Sky TV will put so many measures up when they're watching the game of some of the performance indicators. We don't have access to that sort of information live. Many of the big clubs will, and that is something I think that rolls out again. But again, it's like, what's the stuff that really matters in that moment, and being guided by that. But also, I think the very, very best practitioners have a brilliant eye. The very best analysts, the very best coaches will have a really good eye and will be able to see the game as it is and read the behaviour of the players and understand where motivation is and have a real good idea of momentum. And all those things can play a part. So I think it's a combination of all those things again.
And of course you will through kind of experience of working with a group of players and indeed with individual players, you'll know that even if the data are telling you that player X has run half as far, given the context of the game, given the nature of the game, but also knowing that they tend to come on really strong for the last 15 minutes of the game, you wouldn't necessarily substitute a player whose performance had come down if you knew that they would have that surge towards the end of the game.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's just where quite often this isn't protecting coaches and managers who we get it wrong loads. Of course we do. And ultimately that is the judgment factor. But quite often I always laugh when supporters will sing the song, "You Don't Know What You're Doing." The truth is they don't know what we're doing and why we're doing it, because there will be information that we know that the spectators don't, i.e. where is a player in his physical loading? What is he capable of in this game? What are the changes that the opposition might usually make, and have interpreted a game plan that we've created? What were we aiming for in the early part of the game that might not that might happen in the end, and so on? How might our strategy change? And I think there's loads of considerations, whether a player has had a good week or a bad week, whether they are able to go the distance in the game or not. And all of this can be things that you are in real time, under pressure in the spotlight, having to make decisions that are instant. And the ability to make those fast decisions is so important. So any data you've got to help is important in those scenarios, for sure. But I think it's a huge challenge for coaches and managers. And the higher the level, the harder it gets, I think.
Absolutely. You made me think of three things. I just cannot wait for the day that there's a group of supporters who have got the respect for their manager and their management team, that they chant, "We don't know what you're doing." I think that would be absolutely fantastic. The second thing made me think about. I wasn't aware of those kind of 40 minutes League Two versus Premier League 60. That's really interesting. I'm quite a cricket fan as well as a football fan, and a game of Test cricket, 6 hours of Test cricket, has between 35 and 42 minutes of action in 6 hours of play. So that kind of sets that into perspective. And the last thing you made me think of was Curtis Jones, Liverpool midfielder, who, after his partner gave birth to their first child earlier this year, suddenly went on an incredible rich vein of form. And the commentators were saying, "This is extraordinary. He hasn't slept for 2 nights, and yet he's still able to kind of run box to box." But no, I think that using data to inform what you know about individuals, teams, your strategy for that game, that makes a very, very rich picture indeed. Now, as I said in the introduction, this is your third time round at Cambridge. Can you tell us how important data was in the different roles you've had? I'm particularly interested in your 3 years as manager, but kind of throughout your time at the club, how's that changed? Because you must have witnessed a big change. As you say, lots more providers, lots more information available, better technology and so on.
Yeah, and I think it's just evolved in terms of the use. Our club has grown and the number of people has grown, but for the task, it's still not a huge workforce. And so therefore, when you're people light, you've got to be process strong, and therefore you need as much help as you can. And such providers can almost save you people hours because they can get you really fast answers. So that's massively important in order to be resourceful, to invest in some providers and some platforms that can get you the answers quickly. That saves a lot of people time and gets you faster answers and really accurate and consistent ones. So there's so many ways in which, whether it's the sports science side and the physical data that we're tracking, or the performance data that we're tracking for training or for games, whether that's individually or the team data. As I've said, you can have a gold standard of what good looks like for your team, but the context of any individual game can shift things quite a lot. Data can get really looked into over a 3 or 4 game period, but if one of those games or more, one team has 10 players instead of 11, the data can be skewed quite a lot in so many ways. The first goal in a game can swing what a game then looks like after that so much, because what we do know is there is luck involved, and it is a low scoring game. There isn't so many games, like a lot of the invasion games, like you look at a rugby or a basketball, these type, there's such high scoring games. This is such a low scoring game where very, very often there's one goal in it. And so therefore the room for error is so small, and confidence plays such a hard part, and so does the scoreline and the momentum of a game. So that can dictate things so much. So I think the swing towards more and more data is good in one way, but then it becomes an over-analysis on a really small sample quite often. So one game can be over-analysed to death on the TV, on the news, and internally. And you have to be really mindful that over a 46-game period, or a 50-game or 60-game season, the picture will change quite a bit, and trying to zoom out often enough that you don't make too many snap decisions just off one game, or too many big calls on this player's doing X or the team is in this situation. They just were in that moment, or they were in that game. And there might be loads of reasons for that. But I think that's so important to look a little bit deeper sometimes, and in a incredibly short-term society and game, try and have a bit of a medium-term to longer-term look at whether this is successful or not. Otherwise, the constant changes doesn't really help things. I think back to doing the role of maybe the academy and looking at development of players. So where does data play a part there? Growth and maturation predictors are really important when you're looking at young players and how they might develop and what their peak height might be. And those sorts of things can be important to have some athletic markers to where the future might look. So that would be one. Then you could use data to see how successful have you been? What's the succession and progression rate as a percentage from one age to the next? How has your internal recruitment or external recruitment within your club benefited from the programs that you've run? I think there's so many ways to be reflective and use data to analyze what you've done. And then there's so many ways to look at to predict of how can we better plan for the future and proactively use things. So how would we proactively use the physical data from a game as a manager? I would look at the base level of what the physical performance of our players looks like when we're at our best and what the positional requirements would be for a player at their best. And then I would try to design football training practices that reflect the game, not only technically and tactically and in terms of the challenge that it sets the players, but physically that it demands that you go into a game having experienced some gameplay throughout the week. It reflects what the game looks like. And then you piece those bits in as a bit of a puzzle. So we would create a drill library for training that we would say by the weekend, we need to have looked at these things tactically. We need to have thought about these things technically and in a certain unit of the team. These are the practices that do that. But in the cycle that we're in physically, we need to make sure that we don't overload the players or that we get certain speeds hit this week, or we need a lower level week and what practices fit that week. And that's the planning that would take place every day to organise, but with a macro picture in mind of where are we in the cycle, where's our deload week physically and so on. And I think there's those considerations physically. And the harder one to track is maybe where's everyone psychologically at the moment? Is there momentum in the season? Are people confident? Is there pressure on the games? And how's that impacting behaviour? And so when we track a player's wellness, how are they sleeping? How confident are they? How are they feeling? Those sorts of things can guide a little bit of that conversation as well. So there's a lot that goes into the picture. And ultimately, there's lots of people that contribute to the decisions. But the coach or the manager or the lead person in the end decides what you do. And there can be a whole host of reasons. And that's why in the end, you probably get it wrong more than you get it right. But hopefully the bad calls aren't too expensive for you.
You are quite right. We don't know what you're doing. The richness there is amazing. Hello there. It's your host, Sam here. Well, if you've been inspired by this conversation and want to find out what type of data storyteller you are, why not visit our scorecard at data-storytelling.scoreapp.com, complete 12 simple questions, and you'll instantly be served with a report telling you what type of data storyteller you are. Now, back to the action. When you mentioned sleep, are players all kind of wearing sleep trackers? Are they, or is that self-reported? I'm particularly interested in that.
Yeah, that is a little bit self-reported at the moment. I mean, a lot of people have now got into the Whoop bands or the rings or anything that tracks those sorts of things, but that isn't a provision from the club. That is just something I think as technology grows and improves, like the importance of sleep is definitely not underestimated, but the level of detail that different levels go into and the level of professionalism of the athletes at different levels obviously determines how into that there are. So some individuals at any level would take things incredibly serious and would not cut a corner. They will do everything possible to maximize what they've got. And others will be quite comfortable being them and doing what they do. And they've got as far as they have and they're comfortable with where they are and might not have the same focus in that area or the same desire or free resource to invest in themselves as others might do. I think in the biggest clubs, there would be sleep coaches and they would track things and there would be sleep pods at training grounds so that they could catch a nap early afternoon before they go and train again. And all these things would be considered in terms of that marginal gains theory of traveling with your own mattresses and pillows in the Team Sky team so that you do sleep well. And obviously there's levels to who does what and how things are done, but it's definitely a big consideration. And whilst the level of depth and detail that goes into things can be great, It doesn't take away the fact that you can still be a fan and think the game's not very good or the performance isn't very good. And that can also be true. So whilst there is the whole, I don't say as a protective measure, people don't know what we're doing. I don't mean that in a condescending way. There's just lots that goes into things. And quite often, if the performance isn't very good or the team haven't played very well, the coaches didn't spend all week to get that level of performance. That wasn't what was being aimed for. So yeah, everyone can be disappointed. This is where the emotion of football is amazing. On one hand, we talk earlier about the manager that gets overexcited by a goal and then they get hammered for celebrating a goal and being emotional. They're only reflecting what people are doing in the stands. And sometimes that isn't someone's personality, but in his or her team, there are probably people that do have that psychometrics and are like that, because you have to build well-balanced teams in order for it to work. So it's not a criticism to say that people don't always understand. I think it's just a fact of life that the person who's in the dugout, who's making the most decisions, hasn't blagged their way to get there and has probably got a good idea of why they're doing what they're doing. Doesn't mean it will always work, of course.
I think it's true in many walks of life. I don't know. A supermarket has a terrible Christmas, and the CEO's head is on the line, as if they haven't been looking at all sorts of data all along. I don't say it's surprising, but I think in something that is primarily a form of entertainment and something that generates such kind of emotion and passion, I find it particularly interesting to, Wizard of Oz style, look behind the curtain and see and hear all of that information that you're bearing in mind, alongside that kind of human man-woman management as well. I think it's absolutely fascinating. What's the analytics setup like at Cambridge these days?
It would be probably too grand to say we have an analytics department, because we don't. We have a number of providers and platforms that provide us with different information. We have GPS tracking devices for physical data. We have a whole host of technology and software that can help us measure players' strength and almost wellness, really, to guide their gym programs and their player loading. We would have lots of performance data providers that can show us what are our outcomes individually in games and collectively. And also you can do a lot of that. You can get much of that data on the opposition as well, so that you can prepare for them in your games and also then reflect on games in relation to that, so that the context of a certain game is considered. And lots of the things I talked about, tracking development of players in younger age groups, would be the same as well. So I wouldn't say that it is a huge department, but the way in which we are tracking data to measure our own players' performance and our team's performance, and then have some gold standard to compare potential players against that we might recruit, so that same level of data that we get on our own players, we can access on other ones, so that we have comparable data to say, is that player going to fit in our team? Shall we try and sign them? And then you can pinpoint who are the players we're going after to try and recruit. Now, everybody does that to different and lesser degrees, depending on your resources or belief that some still scout by someone's record and the gut, and some use more data to different levels to recruit their players. It would be something I would say that is becoming more and more introduced here. Certainly in my new role, something I want to try and build and develop, so that we have club intelligence on players around the country and around Europe and around the world that may be a fit for our club, because there is such a small market really to shop in and to find players from. And then not only have you got to do that bit, I mean, we've been amazing at highlighting who the players are to recruit. And we found it really hard to always get those players, because your resources dictate whether you can or can't, or whether you are the one that teams pick. That's just the reality of the food chain of football, I think. And we've got to try and spread the net so we can find more talented players that fit us, and then try to increase the resources and the environment and everything all the time that makes this a place people want to come to. And that's the challenge in recruitment. But recruitment, performance, and development are three massive areas for us to try to invest in a little bit of data. But I think the implementation of this is still early days for a lot of clubs at our level. And therefore, the understanding of it from a lot of people that do these jobs is novice. Like we're learning all the time, actually how to use it, what data matters, creating a common language across the club where people understand what we're talking about. And then only once you've got some success behind using it will the confidence in it grow, and therefore its use probably follow.
Got you. I want to come back to your director of football role and your use of data there in terms of scouting shortly. But as I mentioned in my introduction, you led Cambridge to a famous cup victory away to Newcastle United in January 22. Was there a big role for data played in that legendary giant killing, or in particular, or how did you do it?
Well, was there a huge load of data? No, probably not. I mean, I think with our opposition analysis, you can see where where they are strong, the opposition, where they might cause you the biggest problem on the pitch, the way in which the areas that they try to create their most attacking moments from, where are their vulnerabilities defensively. You can get all this kind of information. So we would use that to guide our game plan. But at the same time, when you go into those games, I don't think data could win us that game. And I think if we played it 10 times, they'd win it 9. So you're looking for the day where they don't quite hit the level they need to, and we have to have the best game of our lives. And we have to be a bit lucky, and we have to have a plan and stick to it. And everyone needs to play 9 out of 10. That's the reality of that game. So, yeah, there's some data that can inform you going in, but then understanding motivation and player levels. The players were going into, for the vast majority, all but one of that squad, the biggest environment they've ever played in, the biggest game they've ever played in, the biggest crowd they've ever played in front of. So there's pressure there. So hyping up the opposition too much probably doesn't help. Everyone knows they're good. We don't need to tell them how good they are. So we made a bit of a joke of how good they were, really. And this was a psychological win more than anything going into that game. We tried to prepare the players for the most. Everything in the build-up to that was going to be huge hype. And it was trying to stay calm and level-headed and try to enjoy that experience. And we'd started the process of that probably quite a few weeks before. A lot of my psychological prep for the team in the media and in the meetings would have been talking about every time the challenge has grown this season, our performance has followed. And it was almost preparing for the biggest moment, that when that comes, that will just be a continuation of our growth as a team. So that's just a psychological tool, really, I would say, to try and help them and to try and take the pressure off. The day before, our training ground was flooded. We had a tiny area to train in. So we didn't train fully or properly that day. But that was okay because we weren't overhyping the game. We were just going to enjoy the whole experience. I made jokes about how their team wasn't anything to worry about and things like that when we were doing match analysis and things, to try to take the pressure off of people. And the thing that we were trying to prepare them for was the roar of the tunnel. When you walk out at St James's Park and there's 50,000 and they've just been taken over and the weight's been lifted off that club. We'd seen in the previous few games that played Man United in the Premier League, the atmosphere, the flags in the stadium were just off the charts. You were watching them on Sky, and we showed those videos and talked about that we were preparing for that moment. Because once the whistle blows, we'll be fine. But we've just got to not lose the game before the whistle blows. So it was about being prepared for that moment, really, and embracing the roar from the crowd and seeing our friends, our family, our 5,000 fans in the gods. We embraced the fact that all of that was going to happen. We went on the pitch before. We just talked about it, really relaxed, and tried to make sure when the game started, we were ready to do what we needed to. And then in the end, the players just played amazingly well. We got a little bit fortunate. The goalkeeper was incredible. We scored first. And it was just one of those days that is a huge highlight for everybody. But I wouldn't say data was the driving force for that. It impacted performance and our game plan like anything else. But the biggest thing about that game, that was a psychological game. That was dealing with humans, not footballers, and dealing with real life emotion, not numbers.
Fantastic. Brilliant. What a great story. Brilliantly told from the inside. I love that. Now you're back at Cambridge in this different role, as you say. I mean, I don't think that this is remotely not a very, very busy job, but you're saying you might have a little bit more time to kind of stop and think. You're as director of football. Can you talk about the main differences between director of football and coach or manager, particularly in the role that data plays in your decision making? How you're using data?
Yeah, I think as a really quick snapshot between the two jobs, one deals more in the business and one in the game. Obviously, coach, you really game to game and a little bit more the business in this role. One probably a little bit more people focused, like working with players every day, and one a little bit more just the industry and the organization and the process. You've got to get the right people in order to roll that out, but that's how I found it to begin with. And so there's a distinction there between the manager's job quite often is you've got a game in 3 days' time, you've got to win it. So it's a very short-term focused job. You can contribute to a middle and longer-term vision, but it's a very short-term job where the turnaround is so fast, you don't have time for the business and the bigger picture. Whereas this job is a little bit more medium to long-term focused. How can I support the people that are doing the short-term stuff, but make sure that everything we're doing is preparing us to be stronger in the future and is keeping us on track to where we want to end up. So I think that they're the biggest distinctions between the two. But so some of that can be, some of the use of data in my role now will be reflective to analyse what have we done over the course of this season? What have we done as an academy over the course of the last 4 or 5 years? And how can that guide what we do next? So that will help us decide what worked well and how we can be better. So I think that's important to review, whether that's injuries, to review our provision to the players, to review our recruitment strategies. You can take a bit more time to get to the answer in this role than you can in the other role. So I think that allows you to actually delve a lot deeper into the data and to make those decisions. And probably the biggest part of this role that's great importance is the recruitment of the next group, the next team, the next squad, or the evolution of your team. And so a lot of the data around what are other players doing, what level are other players at, and building that intelligence as a club. You've got a library of players out there that you can look at to inform those recruitment decisions is probably the biggest part of that. As long as you've got the same data to compare against your own players and your own players internally in your academy, that's a big part of it. That would be how I would distinguish the two roles cleanest.
Very good. Very, very, very clear indeed. Now, Cambridge's Abbey Stadium is always going to hold a very special place in my heart because in the 1997-98 season, I led a team of football gluttons around all the grounds in Wembley, writing what became the Coleman's Football Food Guide. It was a food, football and data analytics journey, if ever there was one. We literally ate all the pies. Our reviewer said of Old Wembley, which came in at number 89, if you sat on your burger and ate your seat, you'd have a better view and more nutritional value. Opal fruits with the vegetarian option at Torquay. But Cambridge won the whole thing. And I'm sure you're familiar with the trophy and the trophy cabinet, the Football Food Guide first place. Can you tell me, more than a quarter of a century on, how are the pies and the bacon rolls at the Abbey today?
I'll be honest, I don't know because I haven't tried them. The way that footy scran, as they call it now, has got probably like pulled pork on a brioche bun these days for £10. I think that's the way that football has gone, which probably shows you a little bit around the industry and how things have changed. I remember those bacon rolls well. They were very tasty. And we were delighted to receive it. I was a fan then, but the trophy still holds pride of place in the trophy cabinet. Unfortunately, not too many other trophies.
It's good. You're talking about pulled pork is good. We marked Arsenal down. Arsenal, I think, came 41st because they did a delicious smoked tuna bagel, but it wasn't footy scran. It wasn't like the Cambridge bacon butties or the Lincoln City full pork roast in a bun for £3. Those were the days. My waistline has got rather smaller since those days, I have to say. Now, listen, I've got a couple more questions. I've got a son who's 21 and playing and watching football is in his blood. He's played since he was kind of 5 or 6. He's a Liverpool fan, so time recording, he's quite excited about that. And I didn't want to inflict my love of Fulham on him. But some of his school friends, some who've done sports degrees or sports management degrees, they're really keen to get into sport, particularly football as they're coming out of uni now, and kind of analytics. Any kind of hints and tips for what the next generation of analysts might do to break into that world?
Yeah, I've probably got 2 parts to that. Well, number one is dive in. Any chance you get, dive in and have a go. I think that's really key. I think there's less and less people now that will throw themselves at something if there's nothing in return for them. And I think anyone that's a little bit older and has got a story to tell, their start was probably putting themselves out to learn, putting themselves out to do things voluntarily, to get in front of people and to just say yes. Don't think about whether you can do it or not. Just say yes and get on with it and find and learn and cope and learn to cope in those situations. I think that's the best. Anyone we speak to, I speak to now, they've got a story to tell like that. And I think there's less and less people that want to do that. And I understand why. And it's difficult to put yourself out. And there's usually a cost, time and money, the two things. But I think anything worth having is worth really working and fighting for. And showing yourself to be willing to a potential employer is a very surefire way of getting respected and liked quite quickly. So I would say that is really important for young people in any field. But certainly in this field, I would say dive in and understand it. On the analytics front, specifically, I would say dive into it and learn your field and be as competent as you can in your area as possible and keep up with modern trends. But make sure you learn how to explain it to people that don't understand it, because you'll be the trendsetters and you'll be at the front of the modern way. But the people that you're probably working for might not have the same level of knowledge. And so that brings you to a bigger part that actually data, science, technology, analytics isn't going away. It's only going to grow. But the thing that also isn't going away is people and humans. And if we don't learn and teach and develop people that can communicate well with people, it won't matter what you know, because if you cannot communicate and have a rapport with someone and build a relationship and connect with a person, then being able to translate that information to somebody else will never be there. And as far as I'm concerned, the computer will never play the game. It will always be people out there that have to be inspired, motivated, and clear to go and play the game. One, for themselves with a clear understanding. And two, we work in a game where you rely on the people around you. So if you cannot communicate and build chemistry and connection with other people, I don't think it matters how much people know in terms of the data that can help guide us. If we cannot translate that to people working with people and communicating with people, I think the game's dead. So therefore, I think that is the biggest thing that I fear as this grows and the data world continues to develop. We lose the ability for young people to communicate well with each other and get that message across. And that's the biggest thing I go on about with people all the time.
That is a fantastic place, a way to draw our conversation to an end. And as a data storyteller, that's how I describe myself. I spend very little time working with all sorts of, with any of the people I work with, any of the businesses, any of the individuals. Very little time on the technical stuff. The vast majority of it is about humanity and empathy and actually making a connection and exactly as, I mean, this is my phrase, but when you say make sure you learn how to explain it to those that you have to persuade them, they might have exactly as you said, they might have a really, really low data tolerance, and you just got one bit of information you can give them, and then you can tell that story around it. So that is a brilliant rallying cry on which to end. Now, finally, Mark, can you tell our listeners, our viewers, where they can find out about you, what you're up to online in social media?
Yeah, I mean, I'll certainly retweet this one. So X and Instagram and LinkedIn are the ones that I'm about, and I just think Cambridge United is a club channel. Certainly, this is a position and a role that is usually in the background. And whilst a lot of the work will be, I plan on being fairly present in the role so that people understand why we're doing what we're doing and know what we're doing. Because the danger in football clubs is every single person in the organisation and every bit of work is judged by Saturday at 3:00. And usually what happens is if you lose, it means everyone and everything is hopeless. And that's so far from the truth. It's just not fair. So it's really important that we shout about the stuff that we're good at. One of the massive values we have as a club is about humility. And that's a really important one, that we don't take ourselves too seriously, that we're really willing to work for each other. But humility misplaced can be that we don't actually talk about what we're good at and tell people what we're doing well often enough. And we need to sell ourselves a bit better as well. So you certainly won't see a shortage of me on all of our social media channels over the future months.
Fantastic. Well, we'll include links to your X, Insta, and LinkedIn, and obviously to the Cambridge United website and assets and so on in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time, Mark. If only there were more people with your approach to using data smarter, I think there'd be rather less malarkey in the world of football and rather more data-driven common sense. Mark Bonner, Director of Football, Cambridge Utd Football Club, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Sam. Thanks.